also convey obligation. For example, he should come to the meeting on time. Now in here, you being referred to is obliged to come to the meeting on the exact time. Now let's proceed to the last two modal verbs. What are they? Must and ought to. Okay, now let's begin with must. Must is commonly used to express prohibition. So, when we say prohibition, you are not allowed to do that action or to do a certain thing. For example, you mustn't disrupt the work more than necessary. Now take note that the word or the modal verb mustn't is in its contracted form. Though it's in a negative form, in here, mustn't is only used. When a modal verb is in its negative form, there is the presence of the word not, while the contracted form, there is a stress between the N and the T with the modal verb. For example, the negative form is could not, while the contracted form is couldn't. Same with shouldn't and should not. Now, do you get me? Okay, very well. Another one is to make a command in a more respectful way. For example, you must do your homework before watching TV. In here, the sentence shows a polite way of telling someone what to do. Now, what's the last one left? Ought to. Now, ought to is the same as should, but in the sense that ought to expresses or shows stronger obligation than should. For example, he ought to come to the meetings on time. He's the boss. So just like that. This could mean that as a boss, you are obliged to come to the meeting on the exact time or before the meeting has started. You should serve as a role model. So that's it. Am I understood? Very good. How did you get the commonly used modals? What are they? Can, could, will, would, may, might, shall, should. What are the two? Must and ought to. Very good. Now, let us proceed to the basic formula of using auxiliary verbs. Are you ready? Very good. When constructing a sentence using auxiliary verbs, there are three things to remember. One is that it must have a subject. Two, it must have an auxiliary verb, of course. And three is to have a main verb. What was it? Subject, auxiliary verb, main verb. Very good. Now, let's take for example, Shang can sing. Now, what is the subject here? Of course, Shang. And the modal verb used? Can. And what does it functions in a sentence? It shows ability. Another one, what is the main verb? Sing. That is why an auxiliary verb or a modal verb is a helping verb to help modify or change or add meanings to the main verb in the sentence. Now, did you get me? Okay, very good. The basic formula of constructing sentences out of modal verbs is quite easy. Now, let us discuss the three things or three rules in using modal verbs. First one to remember is that modal verbs are used as is. When we say as is, it does not change its form, whether in the present, past, or future tense, unlike the main verb. So that's it. Short, can is used as can, as well as could, shall, should, and etc. As well as you cannot add s, es, d, or ed just to change its form because it is used as is. For example, James can cook. You cannot say James can't cook. You can't even say James can't cook. That's wrong. Second rule is to use base verbs after modal verbs. You cannot use to after the modal verbs. For example, he might join us. You can't say he might to join us. That's all wrong. So remember, rule number 2, use base verbs after the modal verbs, and you cannot and you don't need to use to. The last rule, or the third rule, is when in a negative form, you should use the word not, and you don't need to use don't, doesn't, was, wasn't, isn't, aren't, because that's all wrong. You could use not in a full negative form or in a contracted form using the stress. For example, you should not smoke. It's quite incorrect to use you should don't smoke, which is very wrong. The correct way is to use not, like you should not smoke, or in a contracted form, you shouldn't smoke. Yes? Am I clear? Very good. Now, what was the 3 rules in using modal auxiliaries? 1, it is used as is, very good. 2, use only base form of the verbs after modals, and do not use to. Yes? And third rule is use not when it's in a negative form or stress in its contracted form, and you don't need to use don't, isn't, wasn't, aren't, isn't, and the likes. Very good.